Hello friends, as you already know, the name of this channel is Biblical Backgrounds Matter. With that in mind, I do like to try my best to address the Bible, especially the Old Testament, from a historical point of view. But in addition to the history and backgrounds of each book of the Bible, there's the importance of geography. And I would like to share some things with y'all from the surveys of the Old Testament textbook in this short video. Geography of the Old Testament. The history of the Israelite nation developed within a specific geographical context. For this reason, the Bible takes geography seriously. It records real events taking place in time and space. The Bible is not a portal into an artificial and contrived Narnia-like literary history. The Bible, however, is not simply a collection of ancient annals, nor is it intended to be a gazette or topographical manual. Like the science of archaeology, geography expands our knowledge of the setting or background of biblical narratives, and thus enriches our understanding of a given Old Testament text. The physical world of the Old Testament was the ancient Near East, commonly known as the Middle East, or sometimes Southwest Asia, as we would say in modern terms. The Old Testament narratives encompass the region of Mesopotamia in the east, Asia Minor or Anatolia in the north, Syro-Palestine and Egypt in the west, and the Arabian Peninsula in the south. Asia Minor is now referred to as Turkey. The modern states of Iraq and Iran occupy most of ancient Mesopotamia, while Asia Minor is now known as Turkey, and Saudi Arabia controls most of the Arabian Peninsula. Nearly 4/5 of Old Testament history takes place in the area of Syro-Palestine on the eastern Mediterranean coast. This territory now includes the states of Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel. The Old Testament world. The Fertile Crescent. The world of the Old Testament is usually identified with the Fertile Crescent. This area included the Nile River Valley and Delta, the narrow plains along the Mediterranean coast of Syro-Palestine, however you say it, and the Tigris and Euphrates River valleys. Adequate rainfall and irrigation along these coastal plains and river valleys permitted agricultural and settled life, giving rise to the earliest civilizations of the ancient Near East. The first part of this section describes the major geographical regions adjoining this Fertile Crescent and the respective peoples and cultures influencing Hebrew history. Mesopotamia, the name means the land between the rivers, namely the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. The fertile strip of land along the rivers extends some 600 miles from the mountainous regions on the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent to the expansive alluvial plains at the Persian Gulf. Like Egypt, the networks of canals irrigated the floodplain, making lower Mesopotamia especially productive agriculturally. Unlike Egypt, Mesopotamia had no natural barriers protecting the region from outside influence and invasion. The city-state cultures of Sumer and Akkad were responsible for spreading early civilization northward along the river basins. Northern Mesopotamia was the homeland of Israelite origins, in that the Hebrew patriarchs lived in the area of Haran in Padanaram, between the Tigris and Euphrates. Abraham is identified as an Amorite in Ezekiel 16:3. And sometime later, Jacob sojourned among Amorite kinfolk in Padanaram, Genesis chapter 28, verses 1 to 9. We are also told that Abraham migrated from Ur in Mesopotamia, or northern Ur, now suggested as an alternative, northward to Haran, and finally to Canaan, as he followed the revelation and promise of Yahweh. Later Israelite history is greatly influenced by the empire nations of Mesopotamia, with the Assyrians, Babylonians, and Persians all controlling the land of Palestine at some point in their rule of the ancient Near Eastern world. Assyria and Babylonia were also responsible for the destruction of the divided kingdoms of the Hebrews and the deportation of thousands of Hebrews into exile in Mesopotamia. Then, under the enlightened rule of Cyrus and the Persians, these Hebrew exiles were permitted to return to their homeland and rebuild the temple of Yahweh. As you study the Old Testament all the way through, from Genesis to Malachi, you'll find out that although Israel was exiled in Assyria and Judah was exiled in Babylon, eventually they were allowed to go back home and rebuild that second temple. Asia Minor / Anatolia. The region of Asia Minor, situated northwest of the Fertile Crescent, is a rugged mountainous area. It is a diverse land with rich soil and Mediterranean climate in the west and south, a dry and barren central plateau, and steep mountains in the east toward Armenia. The stores of mineral and metal ores in the central mountain ranges afforded the inhabitants of Anatolia a ready resource for commercial trading with the rest of the ancient Near East, for food trading, for food staples, and domestic wares. The peninsula was also the land bridge joining Central Asia and Southeastern Europe, which meant the area was often subject to invasion and foreign encroachment and influence. During the second millennium BC, the central portion of the region was home to the Hittite Empire, a powerful rival to Egypt for control of Syro-Palestine. The Hittites were a military people, hiring out as mercenaries and exporting military technology throughout the ancient Near East. The Hittite Treaty formed, by which Hittite kings subjugated conquered foes, became an important literary contribution to the ancient world. This treaty form was similar to that used by the Hebrews for structuring the writing of the covenant between Yahweh and his people Israel in both Exodus chapters 19 to 24 and Deuteronomy. There are also parallels between certain Hittite laws and the Old Testament, and some biblical scholars even find Hittite influence in the form and practice of history writing in Israel. During the first millennium BC, the people of Urartu dominated eastern Asia Minor and warred with the Assyrians for control of northern Mesopotamia. The Lydians controlled western Asia Minor during the Neo-Babylonian period, 685 to 546 BC. Syro-Palestine. The region of Syro-Palestine, or the Levant, constitutes the land bridge between the continents of Africa and Asia. This 400-mile strip of fertile land along the Mediterranean coast was bounded on the west by the Great Sea and in the east by the Arabian Desert and the deep gorge of the Jordan Cleft. Syro-Phoenicia, or the northern portion of this land bridge, essentially encompasses the modern states of Syria and Lebanon. Palestine, or the southern portion of the land bridge, essentially includes the modern states of Israel and part of the Jordan. Generally, Mount Hermon marked the boundary between the northern and southern portions of the land bridge. The physical and geographical features of Syro-Palestine are described also in this book in a later section, but here's a picture of the map of the ancient Near East. The coast of Syro-Phoenicia had the advantage of natural harbors. This gave rise to extensive maritime commerce centered in the region, especially among the Phoenicians and their key ports of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos. The Phoenicians occupied the northern coast of Syro-Palestine, or the northern coast of Palestine from Akko to Ugarit, and were merchant traders all along the Mediterranean seaboard for nearly 2 millennia. You can read about that in Ezekiel chapter 27. Both David and Solomon were allied to the Phoenicians, resulting in a Phoenician-designed and constructed temple in Jerusalem and a Red Sea port at Elath for Phoenician merchants. And you'll want to read 1 Kings chapter 7 verses 13 to 22 and chapter 9 verses 26 to 28 for some descriptions. During the period of the divided monarchy, King Ahab of Israel married the Phoenician princess Jezebel. This resulted in the importation of the religion of Baal Melkart into the political and religious life of the northern kingdom. 1 Kings chapter 16 verses 29 to 34, and we all know that led ultimately to the apostasy and downfall of Israel. The Arameans occupied the inland regions of Syro-Phoenicia during Old Testament times. They were descendants of the Amorites and the Hurrians and settled at the large oasis of Damascus in Aram, or Syria. The Arameans shared a border with Israel and were alternately enemies or allies of the Israelites, depending on the menacing power and presence of Assyria. Two other important centers of civilization were located in Syrophoenicia, the city-states of Ebla, about 2500 BC, in the northern interior of Syria, and Ugarit, 1500 BC, on the coast of Lebanon. The region of Palestine or Canaan was the land of covenant promise for the Hebrews. However, the presence of the Philistines on the coast and several Canaanite people groups inland meant Israel would not possess the land of Canaan without conflict. Remember that God promised the land to the Israelites, but there was war that had to be fought. They were instructed and commanded by God to destroy all the residents of the land, so that there would be no, should we say, integration between him and the false gods of the land, because he is the only true and living God. The incomplete conquest of Canaan under Joshua left the Hebrews prey to the seductive influence of Canaanite Baalism and its idolatry and immorality. Deuteronomy chapter 7 verses 1 to 5, Joshua chapter 13 verses 1 to 7, Judges chapter 2 verses 11 to 15. The Philistines controlled the coastal plains and remained a potent enemy of Israel right through the periods of united and divided monarchies until King Uzziah, from 767 to 740 BC, subdued the Philistines. 2 Chronicles chapter 26 verses 6 to 15. The Hebrew prophets continued to pronounce judgment on the Philistine cities into the 7th and 6th centuries. You can look up Jeremiah 25:20, Zephaniah chapter 2 verses 4 to 7, and Zechariah chapter 9 verses 5 to 7. And you have the land of Egypt. The land of Egypt lay immediately to the southwest of Palestine and has been known since ancient times as the gift of the Nile. The Nile River was considered a god, little g, by the Egyptians because all life was dependent on the flow of this great watercourse. The Egyptians were an ignorant, delusional nation. The final 750 miles of the Nile River bisected the area known as Egypt in antiquity. The river valley was hemmed in by limestone cliffs on the east and desert on the west. The strip of arable land in the river basin measured from 25 miles to nearly 150 miles in width at the delta. The land of Egypt receives up to 8 inches of rainfall annually, with large portions experiencing less than 1 inch. Agricultural activity was based totally on irrigation of the rich alluvial soil deposited along the river basin as a result of the annual flooding. Ancient Egypt was divided into an upper kingdom along the arrow strip of river valley in the south and a lower kingdom, essentially the delta area in the north. The fact that there is history going back at least 6,000 years should tell you that the Bible is true and is backed up by history and archaeology. The predictable flood pattern of the Nile and great natural barriers of mountains and desert on both the eastern and western borders made for a static Egyptian civilization. Historians often refer to the splendid isolation of Egypt. This enabled Egyptian civilization to develop a dependable, agriculturally based economy, a stable governmental structure, and an ordered society. The early dynastic and Old Kingdom periods of Egyptian history, 3100 to 2100 BC, witnessed the unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the Pharaoh. This early period was also the time of the building of the Great Pyramid tombs for the royal family. The Middle Kingdom, 2133 to 1786 BC, and the Second Intermediate period, 1786 to 1570 BC, would have included Abram's sojourn in Egypt, Genesis chapter 12 verses 10 to 20, the migration of Jacob and his family to Egypt, Genesis chapter 45 verse 16 to chapter 47 verse 12, and perhaps the oppression of the Hebrews as slaves in Exodus chapter 1 verses 1 to 14. The New Kingdom, 1570 to 1085 BC, witnessed the call of Moses as deliverer of the Hebrews and the Exodus from Egyptian captivity, Exodus chapters 3 to 13. Now, as a side note, I'll say in this video that since it is believed that Job is the oldest book in the Bible, and Moses is said to be the writer of Genesis, and Moses probably lived around this time, around 1050, around 1570 to 1085 BC, it is reasonable to believe that Job probably lived and wrote his book about, let's say, 2370 BC. By the end of the Late Bronze Age, 1200 BC, Egypt gained control of Palestine under Ramses II, thanks in part to a treaty with the Hittites. Egyptian intervention in Palestine continued with Sheshonq I, who harbored Jeroboam as a political fugitive from Egypt, not from Egypt, from Israel in 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 40. This was Jeroboam the son of Nebat. He is commonly called Jeroboam the First. Later he invaded Judah during the reign of Rehoboam. 1 Kings chapter 14 verses 25 and 26. Thereafter Egypt remained an important and necessary ally of both the Hebrew divided kingdoms against Mesopotamian imperial powers of Assyria and Babylonia. Later Hebrew history witnessed considerable direct contact with the Egyptians as well. For example, King Solomon married a daughter of the Pharaoh as part of a political alliance in 1 Kings chapter 3 verses 1 and 2. And later King Josiah of Judah was killed by Pharaoh Necho in battle at Megiddo. 2 Kings chapter 23 verses 28 to 30. Egyptian influence can be seen elsewhere in the language and literature of the Old Testament. For example, the Old Testament contains nearly 50 Egyptian loanwords or vocabulary items directly borrowed from the Egyptian language, like abrek, which means bow the knee. Genesis chapter 41 and verse 43 in the King James Bible. There are also the long acknowledged parallels between Egyptian and Hebrew wisdom literature and love poetry. Hebrew poetic and wisdom literature and Job. Hebrew religion may have been compromised on at least 2 occasions by the pervasive influence of the Apis calf cult of Egypt, namely the incident of Aaron and the golden calf related in Exodus chapter 32. You'll remember this was direct violation to the law of God. And Jeroboam's calf worship at Dan and Bethel related in 1 Kings chapter 12. Hebrew statecraft was also influenced by the Egyptians, as the pre-exilic prophets condemned the Israelites for straying from God and seeking alliances with Egypt. You can look up Hosea chapter 7 verse 11. Curiously, Isaiah prophesied that Egypt would one day turn to the Lord and Yahweh would call them his people. Isaiah chapter 19 verses 16 to 25. Moving on now to information about the Arabian Peninsula. The Arabian Peninsula is a massive raised plateau. The land is essentially desert, sand dunes, and lava fields surrounded by somewhat fertile coastal fringes. The peninsula is usually divided into 3 geographical regions: a northwestern area called Arabia of Petra, which includes Petra, Edom, Moab, and the Transjordan; the Arabian Desert in the northern and central areas; and 3, the southern coastal strip called Fortunate Arabia. Edom and Moab are 2 nations or territories or areas that are important in studying the history of Israel and the Old Testament. because they were stumbling blocks to the Israelite journey, and they were judged by the Almighty God. You'll notice that when you read through the Old Testament prophets. The main one in which you'll read about Edom is Obadiah. The extensive desert of the Arabian Peninsula formed a major physical boundary between the river valley civilizations of Mesopotamia and Egypt. For this reason, travel from east to west in the ancient Near East moved in a north-south direction along the Tigris and Euphrates River to Haran and Damascus. The Transjordan region of Arabia of Petra was home to several nation-states and semi-nomadic tribes that figured prominently in Israelite history. The Moabites and Ammonites were radically homogeneous peoples who traced their lineage back to Abraham's nephew Lot and his incestuous relationship with his two daughters. Genesis chapter 19, verses 30 to 38. You'll get a whole lot of your background and history and context from the book of Genesis. They were both monarchical nations organized and governed by a form of tribal kingship. It was the nations of Moab and Ammon that denied the Hebrews passage through the southern Transjordan on their way from Egypt to Canaan. Deuteronomy chapter 2 verses 9 to 37. For this reason, no Ammonite or Moabite was permitted to enter the assembly of the Lord. Deuteronomy chapter 23 and verse 23. Both nations were enemies to Israel during the days of the judges right through the Hebrew united and divided kingdoms. According to 2 Kings chapter 24 and Jeremiah chapter 37, Moab and Ammon aided the Babylonians in the sack of Jerusalem. So Moab and Ammon helped the Babylonians conquer Jerusalem and take them into captivity and exile and into slavery. Even more troublesome for the Hebrews were the gods of Ammon, which were Milcom or Molech in 1 Kings chapter 11 verse 7, 2 Kings chapter 23 verse 10, and Amos chapter 5 and verse 23, and Moab, Shamash, 1 Kings chapter 11 verses 7 and 33. So two false gods of Ammon were mentioned, and one false god of Moab was mentioned. Perhaps the Moabite best known to us is the widow Ruth, who is said to be really the only Moabite that acknowledged the one true God, who pledged allegiance to Yahweh, Ruth 1:16, and eventually found herself in the genealogy of King David, Ruth chapter 4 verses 13 to 22. The Edomites lived to the south of Moab from the river Sered to the Gulf of Arabia. Their lineage may be traced to Jacob's older twin brother Esau. Genesis chapter 25, verses 19 to 26. Now, with that being said, Genesis is divided up into two types of history. First 11 chapters were just basic or primeval history. Chapters 12 to 50 were said to be patriarchal history. They were a rival nation to the Hebrews from the time of the Exodus to the fall of Jerusalem. The prophets Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Joel, Amos, and Obadiah all pronounce oracles of doom against Edom, a people always under the wrath of God. Malachi chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. For more on the place of the Edomites in Old Testament history, you'll want to read Obadiah. Two other groups of people roaming the northern Arabian Peninsula bear mention. The first group is the Amalekites, like the Edomites, descendants of Esau. Genesis chapter 36, verses 12 and 16. And were part of a coalition of foreign oppressors of Israel during the period of the Judges. Judges chapter 6, verse 3, and chapter 7, verse 12. Numbers 24:20 and Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 17 to 19 predict the utter annihilation of the Amalekites for their unprovoked assault against Israel during the Exodus. The second group, the semi-nomadic Midianites, were descendants of Abraham. They lived in the region of northern Arabia. Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 and 2, and verse 18. In Habakkuk chapter 3, verse 7, the Cushites and the Midianites seem to be equated, so these tribes must overlap in some way. Joseph was sold to the Egyptians by Midianite traders. Genesis chapter 37, verse 25 to 36. And Moses married into the Midianite clan of Jethro while exiled in Sinai. Exodus chapter 2, verses 15 to 22. During the period of the Judges, the Midianites were among the foreign peoples oppressing the Hebrew tribes. Judges chapter 6, verse 2, and chapter 7, verse 2. And once again, here is a map of that particular area. Moving on to the land of Palestine. The land of Palestine took its name from the Philistines. The name Pelishtim in Hebrew, who settled along the Mediterranean coast of Joppa to Gaza about 1300 to 1200 BC, according to the Bible. The Philistine people were connected with Caphtor, usually associated with the island of Crete. Jeremiah chapter 47 and verse 4. And Amos chapter 9 and verse 7. Prior to the Philistine migrations, the region was known as Canaan. This term signified a land of purple and was probably derived from the purple dye manufactured by the indigenous peoples from the Murex shellfish found in abundance along the Mediterranean coast. Palestine is often referred to as the geographical and theological center of the ancient world. It was located at the crossroads of the important trade routes of antiquity, the land between the continents of Africa, Asia, and Europe. It was also in this general area that Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all had their beginnings. The land area measures approximately 150 miles from Dan to Beersheba, north to south, and 100 miles from the Mediterranean Sea to the Jordan River, east to west, or roughly the size of New Jersey. The climate is typical of the Near East, mild to cold winter depending on the altitude, with some snow at the higher elevations. The rainy season usually lasts from October to April, with hot, dry, cloudless summer months from May through August. The land is easily divided into 4 basic longitudinal or north-south geographical regions: the coastal plain, the central hill country, the Jordan Rift, and the Transjordan Plateau. You'll want to look up Deuteronomy chapter 1, verses 6 to 8. The major latitudinal or east to west geographical divisions of Palestine are connected both with geographical features of the land and political boundaries of the Israelite divided kingdoms. These divisions included the region of Galilee in the north, Samaria in the north-central area of Palestine, Judah in the south-central portion of Palestine, the Negev, or dry steppe, in the south, and the Sinai Peninsula forming a great natural barrier between Palestine and Egypt. Now, you'll want to move on to some more history here in this book. We'll have the coastal plain, the central hill country, the Jordan Rift, the Transjordan Plateau, the trade routes and importance of the trade routes, all of which we'll get into in another video for some historical information. Until next time, may God bless you, and may this understanding enrich your study of the Bible. And remember that biblical backgrounds and context matter.